Thanks for tuning in to Thoughts for Tuesday, hosted by Bates Communications, a podcast series about business trends and leadership insights from the experts.
Welcome to Thoughts for Tuesday, conversations with successful CEOs, executives, and thought leaders. I'm Suzanne Bates. We're beginning the second year of this program where we sit down with people who are game changers, leading their industries, creating disruption, driving growth, making things happen, and changing the world. And my guest today is Gary Ambrosino, President and CEO of TimeTrade, a high-growth tech company on the leading edge of the online appointment scheduling wave. TimeTrade makes scheduling online a sink, and they have grown about 30% annually for the past 3 or 4 years. And by the way, Gary has a reputation for accelerating sales and valuation growth. Among his career achievements are his leadership at Cognio, where he pioneered intelligent spectrum management for Wi-Fi systems before it was acquired by Cisco. And Gary also co-founded Secure Media, an encryption system acquired by Google. He joined TimeTrade in 2010 as president and COO and became chief executive officer in 2014. Gary, welcome to Thoughts for Tuesday.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Hey, I always like to start at the beginning before you became a tech CEO, growing and selling cool companies. Where did you grow up, and what did you like to do when you were a kid?
Well, I grew up in Allentown, Pennsylvania, which is sort of in the heart of the manufacturing, was when I grew up there, and went to high school there and left there to go to college. But that was an interesting place to grow up. So we did a lot of outdoor stuff, and had a lot of interesting friends in high school, which I always kind of reflect back on as being really fun.
Yeah. So you spent a lot of time outdoors.
Yes. Yeah. Well, growing up, I mean, the big event in our high school was when deer hunting season started, always on a Monday, and so nobody came to school on Monday, and we were outside a lot, and it was that sort of, because it's that geography in the country, and it's, we had the Appalachian Mountains near us, and so I did a lot of hiking and a lot of stuff like that, and a lot of sports.
What were you good at in school?
In high school? Nothing. I had, I almost flunked out of high school. I was not interested in the schoolwork as much as I was some of the outside stuff. I did some very interesting things for hobbies. I was a ham radio operator. We built electronics gear. We did a lot of things. The school part of it, I just wasn't getting very excited about at that point.
Is that when you got interested in electronics and technology?
Yeah, it was from the time I was a young kid. And I remember starting to get interested in that. I was in 8th grade and I was taking a science course, and we were studying weather. And so I started noticing about the weather, and they were talking about the ionosphere and all these interesting things. And I said, boy, and I started pursuing that line of thought. And failed the test because I got a bunch of other books, but they didn't have to do with the weather aspects of it in science class. So I kind of went off on my own tangent and got a lot out of it, which I don't know if that was good or bad, but it was something interesting, and I got very interested and did very well in teaching myself about technology and electronics.
So I know you graduated from Cornell with a degree in electrical engineering, and you have an MBA from Harvard. So somehow you went from a kid who didn't like school to having a pretty successful academic career. How did that happen?
Well, it wasn't as easy as it looked. So when I got out of high school, I had a very limited set of academic options, which was exactly one, which was a 2-year associate degree program at Penn State in Hazleton. And Hazleton is right next to Scranton. And everybody knows Scranton is made famous by the TV show The Office. So we were up in the coal country at this 200-person satellite branch campus of Penn State, and that's where I started. And I'll never forget, I walked into the math class, and the first homework problem was 1 plus 3. And so we kind of started from the beginning in that. But then I did well in that program and gave up that first year and transferred into a 4-year engineering program at Penn State. and the whole time got a very high 4.0 GPA, and then wanted to go to Cornell. They turned me down twice, so I transferred to RPI for a couple of semesters, did well there, and got into Cornell. So it was sort of that climbing somewhat of a mountain to get back into the academic flow of things.
What did your parents do growing up?
Oh, my dad was, we ran a garment manufacturing business in Pennsylvania, which my dad started and which I worked in since I was about, I think, 14 years old or so. Non-tech. We had 200 coal miners' wives working for us. It was a physical manufacturing plant with a lot of machinery, and we made women's sportswear. And what was really interesting about that is you really started to see what running a business was really like. It wasn't about reading the Harvard Business Review. It was kind of about showing up every day and making sure, most importantly, people got paid and they were happy with what they were doing, and you put out a good product. And that was sort of drilled into me from the time I was a teenager.
Sounds like you had a strong work ethic too.
Well, some of it, I think left to my own devices, I wouldn't have been going up there Saturdays and Sundays. But yeah, I think my dad worked all week, and then we went up there on the weekends and built things and fixed things. And usually I came along because he needed the help. And I probably would have rather been out playing with my friends and stuff, but it was also good to sort of see what it really takes. Being successful is not just an accident. You really have to work very hard, and you're probably not taking the weekend off if you've got something going that's important.
Yeah. So you graduated from Harvard with
Yes.
an MBA.
Yes.
And then what?
Well, there was time in between. So I graduated from Cornell with a degree in electrical engineering, and one of the things I found out really fast when I was interviewing for jobs is that I didn't want to be an engineer. It was a little bit, it was less social than I thought would be interesting. And so I got a job as a production engineer at Hewlett-Packard, which kind of fit because I was used to manufacturing things, and we were manufacturing the very first mini computers HP was making, so it was really startup-ish. I mean, it was a little division with 40 people in it. In those days, Bill Hewlett and Dave Packard were running HP, and they had a series of internal startups, and if you had an idea for a business, you could actually go get it funded, and this was one of those operations that I got into. And then the marketing department, whom I was working with on the product release, needed some help, and I had the opportunity to go work over in the marketing department. And so I spent 7 years there doing a series of projects. We started the first mini computer division. We started the first personal computer division. We started the first personal software division there. I was the product manager for the first PCs. We were the first people to OEM Lotus 123 and bundle it. We were doing all these very cool things. It's sort of the dawn of the PC era.
Wow, did you realize that you were at the dawn of this amazing era? I mean, that's just kind of crazy. Yeah.
I think some people did. I don't necessarily think I did. We were just trying, you had crazy things in those days, like trying to figure out what a word processor did. If you push the arrow button on the keyboard where the cursor went, and it was very undefined. And I don't think anybody imagined how big and fast it was going to grow. We were working very closely with Microsoft at the time, and Bill Gates would tell you they were astounded they were at $100 million, and they thought they maybe should have sold the company when it was $50 million, and maybe they could get to $200 million, and sort of that was our frame of reference at the time. So it goes to show you, it's not easy to figure out where things are going while you're in the midst of it.
Yeah, I can remember, at the dawn of the personal computer age, I brought a computer home, and my husband said to me, "Why do you need a computer at home?" Right? I mean, that was how we were thinking back then, right? It just nobody knew where it was going to go. Yeah.
Well, we were selling computers for manufacturing production management. We thought that was an enormous market, and I think the total market for it was probably a couple thousand computers.
Yeah.
What you see along the way is discontinuous kinds of innovations. People take something like a computer, which we were selling at the time. This is a great thing to run your manufacturing facility. Well, somebody got a hold of it and said, well, wait a second, I can take this exact thing and I can start running my marketing department with it. Or I can invent this thing called email, and we can send messages around to each other, and then you saw the market get a lot bigger very quickly. So I sort of lived through all of that, and that really was an eye-opener in terms of understanding tech. And you have to be a super optimist in tech because you never know what's around the corner in terms of the next thing in the market. And if you get off the train too early, you never get to that market. So that I spent, before I went to Harvard, I spent 8 years at HP and was trying to work in startups in the Silicon Valley, and I was getting beat up by people that had MBAs, and it was the early stages of the venture capital industry, and I talked to a few VCs, and they said, well, you really understand how to sell PCs and mini computers into the commercial market, but what about if we ask you to go into a semiconductor company? Do you have a transferable kind of framework for managing business or understanding markets? We're not sure that you do, but it'd be a really good idea if you got an MBA. And so that's really what compelled me to do it, was to sort of get a little bit more choice or versatility in the kinds of things I was doing, because tech moves so quickly.
Yeah. So after you got your degree, how did that change things for you, or what did you do next?
The way it changed things was it probably put me into situations that I was a little bit less able to manage well in, because I think the thing that happens when you go to business school is, for some reason, people think you have a really good understanding about how to be a CEO, and actually you have sort of an almost existential understanding or conceptual understanding about it. But then when you actually start going to do it, you realize you're back to square one, and now this is almost an apprenticeship, and now it's going to require some journeyman work to really learn how to do it. And so that was the interesting switch. I went from business school to, my goal was to work in early stage companies, and I started doing that right away.
So you've been in companies where there's always been cutting edge stuff going on. I mean, you were in the encryption business, the Spectrum for Wi-Fi business, and now the online scheduling business, which I do want to talk with you about. So sure. I'm curious about what sparks your passion. In other words, what makes you say, this is an idea that, I know you don't know for sure, but this is an idea I could get behind.
I think there's always an element of you want to change the world, What you want to do is, and oftentimes you're inventing things, and maybe you say, wow, this would be a really cool idea. And maybe it's so cool that everybody in the world wants it. But everybody in the world doesn't have the viewpoint that we have. And then there's a big giant challenge when you're doing innovation, which is, are we right? How do we prove that we're right? We can create a company around it. Can we get it financed? Can we get market share? Can we get millions of people using it? And so that's I think for anybody doing that, that's a huge motivator. Almost more than the money part of it. It's like, we've got this idea, we've got to get everybody on board with this. It's going to change the way things are done, and you want to be proven that initial idea is right. So you build a company around it.
Can you think of a time when the switch flipped and you realized the idea you believed in was one other people believed in? There really was a market for it. And what happened? How did you know?
The problem is it's not a switch. That's actually the problem. It is sometimes. There are these outliers where somebody will do something, and you'll say you started a company 3 years ago, and now it's going public for $1 billion, and you tend to think, oh, that's the way it goes all the time. But the way it goes most of the time is it's kind of a staged thing. There's eras of confidence. So you come up with something, and you can usually always find 5 or 10 people that want it, just because they like new things. And that's where you get your start. And then the next wave is, well, can you take that same thing and get 100 people to like it? But that's still not a market. But it's validating it beyond just, there's a lot of companies that will buy early technology regardless of what it is, just to experiment with it. And so that's where you hunt for your first customers, and that's where you get your first sales and the first cash flow. And then it's the next, the early adopter cycle that everybody's familiar with really comes into play here. When it really starts to look like a business and you're ramping up a company, like I've been doing, is when you get to between $5 and $10 million and you get a very repeatable formula and you start to say, I really don't have to change anything anymore. I don't have to change the product. I don't have to change the way I'm selling it to get to $25 million. I probably need a lot more resources. And that's probably, in my experience, that's the closest thing to flipping the switch that you see.
When the resources come to you or they get it and they say, yeah, we're going to invest in this?
Well, that's always the proof point, right? So if you get to the point and say, okay, we're doing $5 million, I've got 3 sales reps. If I had 30, could I do $50 million? And if you think you've got a reasonable shot at that, the next test is go out and see if you can convince investors of that. Because investors have seen a lot more of this than you have. And one of the things that, if you're an entrepreneur, you have to be careful about is you should be irrationally confident in what you're doing. And when you go to investors, they sort of strip away the irrationality and see if you've got a core idea that works there. And I always use that as a test. If you can't convince the investors to invest at that point, you need to go back and look at the business and see maybe you don't have as repeatable formula as you thought you had.
Mm-hmm. So I want to talk about the online scheduling business, because this is, something people are getting. A lot of consumers have had a little bit of experience with it, so they're somewhat familiar, at least with what I would guess is probably early versions of it. But I know what you guys are doing has to do with AI and intelligence about how meetings turn out and what you do next. So tell me about that.
Well, we're at the inflection point or the tipping point of the way consumers and buyers will deal with businesses. So the usual, what it's been is, and we operate in business to business and business to consumer settings. So there's, but the process is really the same. The buyer comes to the seller, and a lot of times it's initiated by the seller who's trying to get the buyer's attention. So advertise on TV for a car. I want to find the buyer, and then I want to engage the buyer, and that's the way we'll run the business. And if you really think about it, business to business and business to consumer sales has been a lot like that. What's changed now is, especially with mobile devices, the accessibility of the consumer-driven mandate is now virtually everyone on the planet, and that's where you get things like Uber, where it actually inverts the equation. Now the Uber client is actually driving their business, and they've got some technology that enables it. But you don't see Uber running TV ads to, wave for the Uber cars that's coming by. What you see is customers creating the demand and Uber fulfilling it and building an infrastructure to do that. So it's a different kind of business paradigm, and that's where in what we're doing, appointment scheduling really is about giving the power back to the consumer, and they start to define the relationship they want to have with a retailer or a bank. Or, for example, we're in 12 of the top 20 banks in the United States. We power 35,000 bank branches. And that banking customer is empowered now we've all been through this. I want to go to the bank. I hate going to the bank, but I want to go to the bank because I want to refi my house. But I know if I walk in the bank branch, either the mortgage person's going to be busy or they're not going to be there. So I don't have a very good relationship with my bank. But if you can change that and say I'm going to the bank, and when I get there, I know the mortgage person's there. And not only that, on their calendar, they have my name, and my name's on the screen when I come in. And they're exactly the right person. And now my predisposition to do business with that bank has changed from very low to very high. And that's really the essence of what we do, is we create these consumer-driven conversations. And in business-to-business buying, it's the same thing. If you're buying from a vendor, you want the attention of that vendor. And if you can put the power to get the attention from the vendor in the hands of the buyer, it actually turns out the power gets handed back to the seller because the buyer now trusts the seller. And that trust equation is really the essence of what we do. To do it at massive scale, you need a technology platform, and that's what that's what our business is built around.
That's fascinating. So really the disruption that Uber created, I mean, I'm sure there are other companies that were doing some of that, but we're all familiar with that. Yeah. Changing the equation is going to drive consumer thinking and behavior now, right? We want it everywhere. I don't want to go in the bank and sit there with a lollipop, basket next to me waiting around while some guy gets off the phone, right? That's exactly that was what I was going to ask you about. What was the consumer problem you're solving? It's the frustration of not feeling like your needs are met.
It's the frustration on exactly not feeling valued, and I think customers feel valued when they go into a store or a bank. Some of our largest retailers are cosmetics companies. We have one large cosmetics company, Sephora, and they're driving an enormous amount of business through their stores on a scheduled basis. You can actually do a Google search now and say Sephora Boston or Sephora San Francisco. And in the Google search result will be a little button to book an appointment at the store. It's a TimeTrade button. It's integrated with Google Search through a strategic partnership we have with Google. But when you talk to the retailer and say, what does that mean to you and your customers, they're ecstatic, because it says to our customers what it means is they get a really high level of service at no extra cost to us, because we're utilizing all the folks we have in the store in a more efficient way. So we really like it, and we know when somebody walks in the door for one of these appointments, they'll spend a certain amount of money. And the customer really loves it because their experience is very personalized now. It's this mass personalization of the relationship, and it has an immediate effect of better sales, but it also has a long-term effect. So we find the brand loyalty is much higher, and then the repeatability of folks know they can come back and they're running that relationship with that retailer, and they have access anytime they want, maybe even to the person they always see. It redefines the business, and sometimes it does so in a physical way, because a lot of the physical infrastructure in retailing is designed around walk-in business, and I'm always fond of saying, probably the people best suited to be the next massive bank is Starbucks, because they've got all these wonderful locations to meet with your banker, and banking can be done on a computer now. So the real essence of that banking relationship is, when can I meet you at Starbucks?
That's so true, isn't it?
And that's really we're at that inflection point now in our business where we're starting to see this. Last year we did 100 million appointments for our banks and retail companies, tech companies are using us in the sales area. And we think that's about 3% of the available interest from the public in doing this.
Yeah.
So it's a massive market.
I can see that. So let's talk about you again. You are obviously a pretty productive person. What's the key to your personal productivity?
I'd love to say, I'm one of those guys that gets up at 4:30 in the morning and runs 50 miles and works out and all that stuff and has this hyper-structured day. I would do that sometimes, but I would say just choosing the right set of things to do. I studied this for a while, and I talked to a lot of people, and one of the things you do, to your earlier point, you don't learn this in business school, but you do learn it from observing really high performance people, is you see them choose the right set of things, the high leverage set of things to do. And it's, so I've always approached it with, it's much better if I do one or two really effective things when I get to work or in a sales situation, than try to do 10, because I've got to measure my productivity by effectiveness, not by volume, which for a manufacturing guy is a little bit counterintuitive,
yes.
Because when you do manufacturing, it's all about how much you can crank out. I think especially when you're the CEO, and especially in these smaller companies where your judgment has a big effect on what happens. If you can make one good decision in a day, it's much better than making 5 decisions and saying I was very productive. So I've always approached it like that, and try. And then if you have good staff around you, a lot of these other decisions you might normally worry about, you can leave it to them. They're probably going to do the right thing. The decisions you want to be making as a CEO of a company are the decisions that you have a specific and unique viewpoint on. Maybe you're the only one that has that perspective or information, and that's the one you want to choose to make.
Yeah.
And I find if you just approach things like that, the outcomes tend to be very good.
Did you get there one day just by being overwhelmed by the to-do list? Or was this intuitive for you all your life?
I don't think there's a thing I've done in my life that's been intuitive. No, I think it's the rare person that just has, maybe Richard Branson or one of those kind of guys that's just intuitive about it. And there are people that are like that, but I think most of the rest of us, learn by making mistakes. So, where you learn to do that is after you've I remember some of the earlier companies I was running, you really thought you should be involved in all these decisions. And it's the classic micromanagement complaint everybody has about entrepreneurs. And when you're doing that, you find you get to the other side of that sometimes and you say, well, I made a mistake. I didn't select the most important decision and spend all my time on it. And I probably didn't make a very good decision because I was distracted with all this secondary stuff. So after a while, I think you just start to triage that as, almost second nature after you do it a while. But at first, if you look back on some of the decisions that could have been made better, you often find that you were distracted with something else.
Yeah. Most people say they learn more from their failures than their successes. So since you brought it up, I'm curious about whether you can think of a time when you made a doozer of a mistake and what you learned from it.
Oh, man. Well, that would be a long discussion. I think one of the mistakes I made, I was running this was second project out of business school, a small company here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and it was a group that spun out of MIT. And we were inventing what today on the internet is called DNS. It's basically the telephone book of the internet, how you look up locations and get IP addresses of things. And the internet really didn't exist at that point, but local area networking did, and it didn't have this kind of phone book on it. So we invented it, and you were able to communicate with computers by name rather than by, a technical address. And we started ramping the company. We went out and raised money, and we started ramping productization and selling the product. And the problem was the market was very small. It was usually Novell networks in very specialized situations. And we ran out of money in that company. It wound up getting sold to IBM because one of the things we did do was we built some infrastructure to connect IBM mini computers together, which was a market, not a big one. But the thing I learned there was there is a decision point that you need to get to where you start applying more resource when you're in a very early stage innovative market. And it's not just because you have the money in the bank that you do that. There are some other preconditions of the market that you need to look to before you start to apply capital, because when you're in an investment-backed company, that capital's finite. And if you use it up too fast, the next time you go raise capital, you have to sell way more of your personal stake in the company than you want to. So that was a good early lesson to learn for being in this kind of business.
There are thousands of stories out there like that about startups that ran out of cash. So, it makes you wonder, I guess. You can hear the story, but maybe you have to have the experience. Is that right? When thinking about the folks out there right now who are in startups or thinking of doing a startup, how do you make sure you don't make that mistake?
Well, you get good advice. This is all the textbook stuff is. Get good advice, put together a great board. It's not easy for, if you're a little younger, what comes with maturity is listening more, because you have more of an inventory of mistakes, and you're more scared of making mistakes. So you're going to listen a lot more. the more you do these projects. If you're a little bit earlier in your career cycle, you may not be as receptive because you don't believe you're going to make mistakes. So the textbook answer is, and I think it's right, is, get people around you that know where the potholes are, and they can advise you ahead of time. The other part of it, which is really interesting, is the emotional landscape, because when you're making these decisions, let's say it's something that the company's inventing or some innovation you're doing, you're really bought into it. I mean, you're all in on it. Maybe you have patents on it. Maybe you wrote the code. Maybe it was your idea. And you want to see it go to market. And that's a great deal of conflict with, I'm staring at maybe not getting the results I want, because if I wait a year or two, some other externalities will change that'll make everybody more receptive on my product. And this is really true in technology. If you're making coat hangers, not so much. But if you're making a technology that depends on an ecosystem to develop, or a consumer or user's requirement or pain point, you got to really see where that is before you apply the money. And it's a sort of argument you have with yourself, like, this is the greatest thing, everybody needs to know about it, but if I go now instead of waiting, I could fail at it. And that's a hard thing to develop an instinct for, but that just takes experience.
We work a lot with CEOs and leaders, and I'm always curious to talk with CEOs about what role leadership has played in the growth of their companies. How would you describe yourself as a leader, or how do you think about leadership, especially now that you've been at the helm of a few companies?
I would, the headline on that is, I think management is overrated. And you go to business school and get trained on how to manage, the right way to do things, how to put processes in place. Very applicable to large companies, because a very big Fortune 500 company is like an oil tanker. It just takes a long time to point it in a different direction. And so it's very process intensive, and that's probably more management focused than leadership focused in a lot of ways. In the scale we're operating, we have 125 people here. I've operated in companies that, up to 400 or 500 people. That's where I think management's very overrated. I think it should take a day or two to manage a company of that size, meaning that day is what you're spending on processes and reporting or metrics. I think leadership is what you spend most of your time doing. And you should spend your time really setting clarity around the goal, because think about it, you're trying to, when I started here 9 years ago, we were in the appointment scheduling business. We had one customer, it was Petco. Dog grooming, appointments for dog grooming, who would have thought, right? So what you've got to create is a belief system that this is going to be more than just dog grooming, right? It's going to be 150 banks. How do you
do that? I mean, you walk around saying it's not just pet grooming.
Yeah, you do. Yeah, I think you do. But I think the CEO's in a unique position, because what you really can start doing is bringing things from outside into context. So you might say, look, and this is the way we actually got started in the banking industry here. As a matter of fact, I brought a friend of mine in here who ran a very successful banking technology company, and he sold it, and I brought him in here, and he met with our team, and I talked to him afterwards, and he said, there's no way you're going to get any banking business. It's just too hard. You'll never. He said, I've struggled with this took me 15 years, and the time scale you're trying to operate on is just not realistic.
I'm assuming that motivated you even more.
I would say it's sort of, it was a very good case study, because I was able to actually, tell me about what your impediments were. Tell me where you struggled. And I went back and tested it against what we were thinking about, and I thought to myself, I don't think we're going to have those struggles, because I think we're a little bit newer technology or whatever. But what you can start doing is then bringing, and so that wasn't the context I felt like bringing to our team necessarily, but it got me to think about what I did need to bring to the team. And what you can start bringing to the team is you start building a conceptual map of, it's not something to do with dog grooming. It's something to do with how consumers want to operate. Let's distill that into something, and then let's take that and map it into the larger world. And let's start dialoguing about that, because you have some time. You do it over a year period. And I think by exposing everybody to these ideas and sort of letting them see around the corner too, you get everybody on board with that. And then it comes to pass, because it does become a self-fulfilling prophecy. A lot of times if you believe the market's there, you start constructing a product to get to it. And so we got our first bank 6 years ago, and it happened to be the largest bank in America. Because I called up my friend and said, "Guess what?"
So that must have been a fun call.
Yeah, it was. It was. So and subsequently now we have over 100. So I think that's a big part of leadership. I think the other part of leadership, and probably the harder part of leadership, is as a CEO, you are responsible for the performance inventory in your company, meaning you're responsible for judging the performance of your people. And high-performance companies place very high demands for performance on their people, and they place very high expectations on themselves as to the type of person they're going to hire. And there's a real positive side to that, which is it's a lot of fun to find great people and work with them. The harder part of leadership there is when people are not performing. Really successful companies do something about that very quickly. And as the CEO, you're leading the charge on that. And that's the harder set of decisions to make. If you don't lead yourself down that path and make those decisions, you wind up maybe getting B or C grade performance out of your team, which you don't want. So I think those two things are really, really important, and you've just got to just be very confident, because organizations with high performance people in them do, absorb the confidence of the leadership, and sometimes confidence carries you pretty far.
So speaking of high performance, I know you're an extreme sports enthusiast. You've done a lot of cool things. You recently climbed Mount Rainier. What would you say is the connection between your passion for extreme sports and your success in business?
Well, we climbed Mount Rainier a while ago. We just recently did Mount McKinley in Alaska. It's a 20,000-foot mountain. And I just think it's just a terrific paradigm for doing this sort of thing in high tech, which is what's really attractive about it. And here's what the paradigm is. Alpine mountaineering, which is the sport I pursue, is really, being successful at that requires being really good at risk management. Because it's not a very fun sport if you're getting hurt or you're putting yourself in dangerous situations. It's a fun sport if you're doing things where you complete an expedition. In the case of we were on McKinley for 4 weeks, so it was a very big logistics. You complete an expedition and say it never really was dangerous, and the reason is we eliminated all the things that we were worried about, and that's one great thing about it. And the other great thing about it is it's the ultimate team sport. I mean, you're clipped together with 4 to 6 other people on a rope. You're completely dependent on each other. There's no outside remedy to a problem. You have to remedy it yourself. And the most important currency you have in those situations is trust. So all of those things, when you look at that sort of in vitro and then transfer it into what you're doing in a startup company, it's really very similar. So I see, the risk management, the codependence, the trust, and you do a lot of that when you take investor money. You're trying to minimize the risks in a way that you can be successful at what you're doing. You don't get any points for running off the end of a cliff with a startup. You just lose your investors' money, and so I think those lessons transfer really nicely to what we're doing.
So for people who, and that resonates for everybody, by the way, whether you're a startup or a large company, I mean, building trust in teams and getting teams to work together, I mean, that's one of the things that we work with companies on all the time. We measure it with, what are the qualities of high-performing teams. But if you boiled it down to, something or a few somethings that you think really create trust in a team, what would you say those are?
Well, I grew up in a family business, so which is always an anomaly when you look at professionally managed companies or investor-backed companies versus a family business. In a family business, there's not the pretense of positioning. It's really, I work for my father. It's really hard to go spin something to my father, right? So you learn early on, better just tell him, you broke the thing, and it's offline, and you got to do something about it rather than saying, I don't know what happened, that whole thing. I think trust in management teams, especially in these small companies, is you've just got to be willing to be very straightforward. You're trying to do a really hard thing, which is create a market or a technology. There's a lot at stake. You're blowing through millions of dollars a lot of times if you're still in the, we're fortunately not in that stage where we're consuming more than we make, but you do go through that phase, so the stakes are pretty high. And you've really got to focus on talking about the thing that makes you successful. So if it's a product, it's got to be a great product. We're going to have a straightforward discussion whether we think it's great or not. If we're taking a risk on a new organization or making a new investment somewhere, we've got to have a really open discussion about what we think the pluses and minuses are doing this with. What we need to eliminate from that equation to have high trust is we need to eliminate parochial viewpoints or territorial or political viewpoints or personal agendas, because it really, the companies are too small to have team members sort of advancing a political agenda, for example. So I think you build trust when you try to create that setting, and it doesn't necessarily mean everybody's really nice to each other all the time. As a matter of fact, some of the most productive conversations you have, somebody will walk in and say, well, we're doing something with the product, and somebody else says, that's the dumbest idea I've ever heard. We can't possibly do that. And you have this raging debate over it, and it's and I guess you have to have a little bit of a thick skin for that. But as you do that over time with the same group of people, you sort of build up a repertoire of war experience, and that tends to build trust. And I think disagreeing with somebody or being transparent on what's going on is not the same thing as evaluating whether you or they are doing a good job. And if you're going to build that trust equation, you've got to absolutely separate those two from each other. Because I think where it really gets dysfunctional, and you see this a lot, especially in larger companies, is somebody's opinion about the product is immediately interpreted as to their opinion about how well you're doing your job, which could be probably nothing farther than the truth usually. So hard to do. I mean, it's managing hundreds and hundreds of meetings and conversations and creating a chemistry set of the right people involved over a period of time that builds the trust.
Yeah. So last question. What advice would you have now for yourself when you were a new CEO?
Well, listen to people more. If I had to criticize myself around one thing, it would be try to find really good mentorship early. Because I think you asked the earlier question when we were talking about business school, you get this kind of false impression of business schools. I know how to do this. I did 700 cases, no problem. I can run American Airlines, no sweat. Just put me in this spot. Nothing could be farther from the truth, because there's an emotional landscape there that you have to contend with, which is not something that you kind of run yourself through when you're in a classroom. But when you're running a company and you're under pressure, especially when something's going wrong or you're faced with a dilemma, you may not be making the clearest decision. And so what is really essential, and career decisions, sometimes you're under pressure with those. So it's really essential to have a mentor or two or three where when you really feel like, I'm not sure I'm thinking clearly here because I've got a lot of pressure over something, or I just went to a board meeting and they just, threw something at me that really is a curveball and I'm not sure what to do and I'm scared. So the minute you start saying that to yourself, because usually you will be scared in these jobs if you're not, a little bit antsy about the risks that you're taking or the way you're driving things, you might not be doing enough to move the thing forward. But you got to realize when you're operating in that setting, it's really important to have somebody to call up on the phone and say, I'm thinking about doing, here's what's going on, I'm thinking about doing this. What do you think? And it's essential to have somebody sitting out there that's made that mistake 5 times. And they say, okay, well, I was in that situation, and here's what happened when I did it. And what that tends to do is create a lot more clarity about what you're thinking about at that moment, in the moment, because there's also, in decision making at this level, there's also a time element. You usually have to make very fast decisions. You can't study it for months and months and months. The advice I would give myself is, you could have avoided a lot of angst, where you maybe could have made some better decisions and probably could have made some of these companies perform better if you had done a lot more of that, rather than just a little bit of it, done a lot of that, and not be concerned about always being right, because the right answer is the answer that makes the company successful. It's not necessarily the right answer being you thought it up. And I think of of all the situations we faced, I've been in 8 or 9 of these companies at this point, that would be the one consistent thing that I would have liked to have been more aggressive about early on.
Great advice. Gary Ambrosino, CEO of TimeTrade, thank you very much for a wonderful conversation.
Well,
really
thank you
enjoyed
very
it.
much. I learned a lot from your questions. Thanks.